Hey guys, Jake Raby here, Flat 6 Innovations, bringing you another REV2 technical video with our focus on bore scoring series. And it's 2021, we want to say today it is post-pandemic. So we've gone through our videos, we went back and reviewed all the content from the 2018-2019 bore scoring video series, and we've made sure all that content is up to date, accurate, and still what we're seeing here in 2021. So this particular video is on preventing bore scoring, and with no further ado, let's get into our content from 2019. So the focus of this part 5 of the bore scoring series is on the prevention of bore scoring. Everybody out there wants to hear me say the one thing, the one silver bullet, if you will, that they can do to make sure they're not going to have bore scoring. You're never going to hear me say it because it doesn't exist. We've already said before, bore scoring is an equation. It creates a sum, and that sum ends up being the bore scoring, okay? There's no one thing that you can do. There's no one oil you can use. There's no one fuel you can use. There's no one way you can drive the car. There is no one way of anything that can be done to prevent bore scoring. I said that 3 years ago. I said it 10 years ago. I'll probably say it 10 years from now. I hope I don't. I hope I say that I was wrong in 2021 because something has happened that was groundbreaking that we found that can be done to prevent it. But that is not reality. That's not where we are 18 plus years into developing these engines, with number one failure mode being bore scoring that we started with. Before we even did IMS development or anything, we were working with bore scoring. That was our first and foremost problem. It was the first thing that really struck these engines were cylinder bore problems, be it slip sleeves, cracks, whatever. That was the first thing we worked on with LN Engineering. So 18 plus years into it, I will tell you there is not one single thing you can do. There is no silver bullet in the cylinder of your revolver, if you know what I mean. You can't go kill the werewolf because there's no silver bullet. But the one thing that you can do to mitigate the chances of this happening is the same thing that we've always said. Drive the car, maintain the car, and do these things even if you don't think you need to. So last year, pandemic, 2020, the year we'll never forget, your car probably stayed parked. That was the worst thing that could happen to your car. The fuel got old. The oil got old. The tires got old. The tires got flat spotted. You could tell that when you drove the car, right? For the first time after it sat idle for a long time. You guys that go to the track didn't go to the track. There were no track events, okay? So now you need to do more service work to your car because that old fuel kind of took a toll on the fuel injectors. We've talked about that. Not from a cleanliness perspective, but from a corrosive wear perspective, okay? Also, the oil has been in service 24/7, 365 during the pandemic. It didn't take a break. It didn't take a break just because you weren't driving it. Your oil is in service all the time that it's sitting in that engine. If you're here in the south, it builds humidity and all these things. If you're in the north and you crank the car and just drive it a short distance, it doesn't get hot enough to burn impurities out of it. So those are critical things. So you're going to need to make sure that setting around over 2020 did not do bad things to your car, okay? Take the car out, drive it as intended, service it more than the owner's manual tells you that you need to, which in my case, I require every 6 months for 5,000 miles. with the time being just as or more important than the mileage driven. I hear people all the time say, it's due for my annual oil service. If you are part of that camp, you are begging for cylinder bore scoring. You are not doing your part. You may be following what the owner's manual tells you to do, but things influence that owner's manual outside of what we know today. Okay? So let's get right into all of our previously recorded content. I want you guys to drive the car, I want you to change the oil, I want you to use good fuel, and I want you to enjoy the ownership of a modern day Porsche. All of our other series, we've talked about the doom and gloom. And that's just the reality we see here at Flat 6. And I want to go into this lecture today with you guys, helping you understand that we only see bad cases here. You know, we do get some elective builds. A lot of times those elective builds come in with something that's an underlying condition that nobody knew anything about. They didn't try to prevent it because they didn't know they had a problem. And the doom and gloom is just part of what we deal with here. We are specialists in the inner workings of these engines and the manipulation of these engines to make them into things they never were before. That's what we do. So the doom and gloom, it just goes along with what we practice here, okay? So today, it's going to be a little bit of unicorns and rainbows, something I haven't talked to you guys about because we've been talking about the failure. What happens with a failure? How do you diagnose the failure? Today, we're going to go over the things that you as a car owner can do to hopefully prevent the bore scoring from happening. So the first thing that I want to go over is the fact that you can only do so much as the current owner of this vehicle. And I can't say this enough. I kind of put this akin to someone who has been a chain smoker for the last 40 years. They find out they have cancer and now they stop smoking. Okay? And I know that somebody out there has probably had this happen before, okay? I know because my mother went through that in 1990. At that point in time, it was too late for her to stop smoking, but she did anyway. You as the car owner, if you did not own this car since new, and if you did not practice all the things that I'm telling you to do today, it's a little too late, but it's not too late. It's never too late to have corrective action for something that we know is a problem. At the same time, the newest of these cars is 11 years old at the filming of today's video. And basically, for the majority of that time, at least the last decade, no one really knew exactly the best things to do to this engine to help keep it alive. No, the owner's manual did not have your best interest at heart. That owner's manual was put together as a projection. But today, 11 years later, time and service, calendar time, miles, wear, people like us as specialists taking these engines apart and seeing the same problems over and over again helps us to determine the things that play into this so we can help you understand what you need to do to hopefully prevent it. So what are some of the things that you, as the current caretaker of this vehicle and its engine, do to help prevent the bore scoring? Well, like we said, it's not unicorns and rainbows, but we know that anything we can help you do is going to help you help yourself in making this car and engine last as long as possible. So the first and foremost thing is you must stay attuned to the engine, okay? Those noises and the things we went over in the part 1 of this particular series and all the things all the way up through part number 4 are going to help you understand what bore scoring sounds like. A lot of times your first symptom of this will be a ticking sound that is very confusingly similar to that of a lifter. Again, I'm going to state these engines don't have lifter problems from a noise perspective. If these engines have a lifter problem, it usually will end up showing itself as a misfire, an individual cylinder misfire. At the same time, that also can be confused with bore scoring, as that's another symptom. Now, the symptom of misfires and bore scoring occurs usually at stage 3 or stage 4 at the total end of the bore scoring after you have other symptoms typically, okay? But staying attuned to the engine, understanding what your oil consumption is per 1,000 miles driven, and we went over how to do that equation and keep track of that, That's one good way to make sure that you're staying attuned to it. If you see a sharp spike in the oil consumption and there's no reason for that, that can be telling you the engine wants an oil change, or it could be telling you that it has a problem that you need to take care of. That could be a problem with fuel enrichment, which we'll go over a little later in this video, okay? But staying attuned to the engine is a key in helping to notice things that are changing with the engine. The quicker you can notice those changes occurring, the quicker you can apply intervention to make sure those things don't make a problem worse. The next thing, as the caretaker and operator of this particular engine, you need to understand the proper way to warm one of these cars up. This isn't the 1950s or 60s or 70s. We have things playing into wear with these engines and issues like bore scoring that come from driver error. Now the thing is, you may not know it's driver error. You may be doing all the things that you've been told to do over all these years. But here in the trenches at Flat 6, we hear the same stories over and over again from long-time vehicle owners. Sometimes the guy that bought this car new still owns it. He tells us the way he's driven the car, and he actually thinks that he's been doing everything right. But when we take his story and dozens and hundreds of others that we've heard, and they're all the same story, and they all end up with bore scoring, we start to connect those dots, okay? So again, everything that we share with you here on Written Vision comes from direct hands-on experience, and these hands have done a lot of it. So the hands-on experience is what you can't get anywhere else, okay? But it's also something that, we're telling you things from that first-hand perspective, and we're not regurgitating information that we read or hear from other places, and that means a lot. So when we're able to connect these dots, it tells us more about the story than anything else. So the point I'm getting to here is when you're operating your car, especially in a cold weather environment, because in the beginning with bore scoring, we only saw it in cold environments. Now we see it from pretty much every environment. And a lot of reasons for that is because these cars are on their second, third, fourth, fifth owner, and they have moved around across, sometimes from Canada into the United States, or the upper northern states to Florida. And we have a lot of bore scoring come from Florida, and the reason why is because a lot of the snowbirds that travel to the Northeast drive their Porsche to Florida, where they have a winter home. They trade the car in while they're there. That car is then confused as a Florida car, even though it came from New York, and it has bore scoring. Carfax will tell you that. Again, it's another way we connect the dots. Okay, we're not assuming things here, folks. We are actually connecting these dots in every case. We go back through VIN numbers, we do Carfax reports, we try to figure out what it takes to put this puzzle together. So, as the driver of the car, what I do, and I'm not going to tell you why I do it, I'm just going to tell you that's another whole video, but if you get in your car, I don't care how cold it is in the morning, crank the car up, put your seatbelt on, and then slowly drive the car away, your car will warm up at the proper rate, okay? In my development, I've learned that a stock thermostat in one of these cars will be completely open after about 6.5 miles of driving, even in a completely cold environment. If it's 15 degrees outside, I see that. Of course, if it's a 95-degree day like it is here today in the spring in Georgia, it's going to warm up quicker, but usually 6.5 miles in that neighborhood is where the thermostat will be fully open, and you're usually at 180 degrees. Now, if you look at the temperature it takes to get that to happen, or really the duration of time it takes for that to happen, if you crank the car up and let it sit there and idle. If you do that, the car has no load. So I want you to understand what builds engine temperature is load, okay? Load is going to create the heat that creates the coolant temperature rising that helps to get things moving. The slower the engine warms up, the longer it stays on cold start enrichment. I want to say that again. The slower the engine heats up, the longer it stays on cold start enrichment, and also the longer it stays in the just started fuel regimen, okay? Or at this point in time, when the engine first cranks up, everything in the car is worried about the environment, okay? It's not worried about long living, it's not worried about mechanicals, it's worried about the environment. You fire this car up, secondary air comes in, camshaft timing changes, ignition timing changes, fuel enrichment then changes to help light off your catalytic converters, okay? Everything about this car and onboard diagnostics second generation is about making the emissions work, okay? Again, we're not worried about wear at that point. Car manufacturers have to meet the standards set forth by the US EPA as far as bringing cars into this country. So everything was set up from that perspective. You end up in a situation where what is best for the environment ends up not being best for the engine, okay? So over and over again, the cars that come here from original owners that say, I've always cranked it up and let it warm up for, in the mornings or whatever. Sometimes people do that because they don't want their butt to get cold. They want to get in a warm car. Just understand, if you're doing that, you are not doing what we have learned is best for the inner workings of this engine. All right, so don't think I'm saying get in, crank the car up, and fly down the road. I'm not saying that. That's exactly opposite of what I'm saying. Get in the car, crank it up, listen to it, throw your seatbelt on, and slowly drive away. I short shift at about 3,000 RPM up until I see the coolant temperature at 180 degrees. If you have a 997 and you have a coolant temperature gauge and an oil temperature gauge, you can see that your oil temperature is very slow to respond in cold conditions based on the ambient air and the things that are playing into it. The oil takes longer to warm up than the coolant does. The heat exchanger on the top of the engine has a job of helping to make the oil and coolant warm up at a similar rate. It doesn't work that well in a really cold environment, okay? So if you have an oil temperature gauge, I want to see 200 degrees on that oil temperature gauge before I get on the car and I go flying around the mountain roads, okay? So don't get in the car, crank up and go, just take off like you're a lunatic, okay? Crank up the car, drive away at a reasonable speed, and pay attention to things. Short shift at 3,000 RPM, and watch your coolant and oil temperatures if you have an oil temperature gauge. So moving on is your caretaker role, and you're trying to do the right thing, and we want to help you do the right thing, because if you don't do the right thing, you're going to end up calling Flat 6 Innovations or submitting a ticket, and you'll be another statistic, and we don't want that to happen. We keep a one-year backlog, and certainly we want your business if you want to give it to us. At the same time, we want to make sure that these engines stay on the road. We'll never even be able to build 1% of the engines for these cars with the way that we do our quality versus our quantity here, okay? So helping you help yourself means we want you to understand used oil analysis, okay? Used oil analysis works from trend data. You can't just do one used oil analysis and think you're seeing a big picture of the engine. It doesn't work that way. Very recently, I had a customer of mine from over 10 years ago with an air-cooled Porsche, and he had collected 15 different samples from his engine, but he didn't send them in. And this was a competition engine that he used for autocross and a lot of different things. He put a lot of time on it on the street and on the track, and it featured a failure. Now, if he had actually been sending in those used oil analysis, we would have been able to take in the trend data and predicted a failure. We actually took his 15 samples after the fact. He had chronological order on all of them, mileage, oil type, all that sort of thing, and we were able to put all those together and actually watch the engine fail. It was very unique. We knew it failed because it happened before we did the used oil analysis, but having all those 15 samples, we watched the symptoms show up at about the 6th oil change, and then toward the end, it looked like the wear had gone away, but the wear didn't go away. What happened was the wear particles got so large, they were no longer being detected by the oil analysis. Had we seen this as it was unfolding, we could have predicted this engine would fail. Now, we couldn't do that off just one of those samples, so it takes trend data. Okay? So you might ask yourself, where do I send the used oil analysis? Now, if you go out there and Google used oil analysis, there's a very popular company going to come up. And this company's been watching our videos. And the reason I know this is because since the video bore scoring series has come out, they've changed their commentary. Now, this is something that bothers me as a creator of this stuff and the person that's understood this since day one, because they're not giving us credit for this. And that's concerning, okay? So, they know who they are, and they're probably watching this video today, and if they've not, they probably will be because they want to learn like you do, okay? But when we start doing videos and we start showing high silicon content and high aluminum content coming up together, we're the first people to ever share that, and all of a sudden now a very well-known oil analysis company that never said that before and actually misdiagnosed failures because they didn't say it has changed their tune. So I'm just bringing that up. So when you see high aluminum and high silicon content, we have to start thinking that the bores in this crankcase that have high silicon content and high aluminum content are starting to fail, okay? And if you have the trend data over at least 5 or 6 used oil analysis, you can start to put those trends together. Now, if you do the used oil analysis, stay consistent. Don't change oils up every time. If you're dedicated to this, you want to omit as many variables as possible. In development, we believe in OFAT, one factor at a time. You really try hard to keep the variables to a minimum. The more variables you have, the dirtier your data is. So get on an oil, choose the one that you want to use, stay on it, choose an oil analysis company like Speed Diagnostics, who is dedicated to the Porsche engine health, because we know this from grassroots. Speed Diagnostics was born from Lake Speed and the Driven Oil program, who's been working with these engines as long as we have. So if you use something like Speed Diagnostics, you're going to get really good consistency. You're going to get an analyst that really understands the composition of the engine. And who knows, they may even send me something for a recommendation if they haven't seen it before, okay? So used oil analysis from the proper company with good consistency with you as the caretaker of the car is another way to help prevent bore scoring. Next on my list is probably the topic that I absolutely hate the most. It's the one that creates all the bickering on forums, and usually comes with people with really big opinions on things about engine oil. And the funny thing is, most of them don't even change their own engine oil. So when you go on forums and you're typing in things, you're reading stuff on Facebook or whatever, you have to really sit there and ask yourself, what has this guy done? Do I know more than this guy does? Is he just telling me something that he wants me to hear because he's being, trying to endorse somebody? What does this person really understand? Well, again, everything we're going to share with you here at REV Vision is firsthand experience. And I will tell you that one of the biggest things you can do to help keep your engine alive and resist bore scoring is a shorter oil service interval that is very consistent, and use the proper engine oil, okay? These are keys. Now, what with the proper engine oil back when your car was new has probably changed. If you have a 996 or if you have a 986, you need to look at the most recent Porsche recommendations for engine oil, and you will see that in January of 2019, their recommendations for engine oil changed. It's no longer what it was before. And honestly, the sticker in your deck lid, under your deck lid, no longer pertains. So you need to understand that even the mothership, even the factory has changed what they're telling us, okay? And what they're telling you. So those pages in your owner's manual can be removed. And you need to understand that every oil that I know of today is different than it was 10 years ago. We constantly do oil development. We're constantly seeing differences in the way oils feel on our fingers, the way they smell, the way they look, how they are to clean up when you spill them on the floor, the smell that we see when you have an engine consuming that oil. These are all the things that we get with our senses here at Flat 6 from direct hands-on experience and being in these trenches. So understand that not what your friend is doing is the right thing. Not what your peer is telling you from an opinion perspective is probably the right thing. You need to do your own investigation, and hopefully you'll use oil analysis and your own direct experience to learn the same thing we have. Okay, so oil service interval. This is probably the number one thing that we see that plays into bore scoring. As we survey our customers, the people that have had these failures, unfortunately, a lot of them just bought the car. They've had the car 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months, 5 months. They just bought the car. They're still in love with the car. Now, the guys that just bought the car 3 weeks ago and now they have a symptom, they probably bought a car that somebody else knew had a problem, unfortunately. And people not doing pre-purchase inspections and not doing invasive pre-purchase inspections are causing this, okay? We get messages all the time, thank you so much for the videos. I took my car to a so-and-so shop to have a PPI done, and they found that it had bore scoring, or they found that it had an IMS bearing failing, or whatever the case may be. So, you know, a proper PPI that is semi-invasive is a key with a lot of this if you just purchased a car. Now, from a perspective of what you want to do for oil service interval, my rule here at Flat 6 for all of my engines has been and will remain 6 months or 5,000 miles. And the 6 months is actually more important to me than the 5,000 miles. We have some guys that drive 200 miles in 6 months. Guess what? They still have to change the engine oil. Your engine oil is in service 24/7, 365 days a year, especially if the car is not sitting in a controlled environment. If it's in a hot, humid garage here on the East Coast somewhere, that's about the world's worst for condensation soaking into the oil. The condensation helps to build acids in the oil, which then starts corrosive wear. We've already talked about a lot of this sort of thing. So my recommendation, 6 months for 5,000 miles, no matter what oil you're using. You will help to keep the old stuff purged out of the engine. You'll keep contaminants to a minimum. You'll keep fresh engine oil in that engine, and it's always going to reward you with longer service and less wear. We've already determined this over the years. 6 months for 5,000 miles, and you can't go wrong. So why is the calendar time more important than the miles driven? Well, I just talked about the fact that you have contaminants and things build up in the oil, and if the oil sits static in the engine a lot of times, those things will attack it more. And like I said, here in the East Coast where you have higher humidity, that really plays into it, especially if you have a hot garage or something like that that you park the car in. Now, with my engines, I've always determined doing used oil analysis that the guys that change their oil at the recommended time, in calendar time, always have better used oil analysis than the ones that drive 5,000 miles. Some people will not listen to me. Even though we're the creators of the engine, we came up with all the things that we've reworked inside of it. We've dedicated our lives to this goal. They still don't listen. But those people that don't listen teach me more than the ones that do. We already know what's going to happen if people listen to us. But if they don't listen and they run the 5,000 miles and it takes them 2 years to get there, I might see their used oil analysis looks twice as bad or 3 times as bad as the guy that did it in 6 months, no matter the mileage, okay? Same thing goes with guys in Canada, people that store cars. We always recommend changing the oil before storage, just before you store the car, and then drive it a couple hundred miles and change the oil after storage. The storage oil is not a good oil to be running over the summer, okay? It's got contaminants that built up in that oil over time. These things are all loosely tied into bore scoring. You know, maybe that's another reason why the cars from up north have more scoring. We always know that temperature and location are playing into this. So it's more than one particular thing. It's not just the warm-up times, not just the cold environment, but maybe those cars, most certainly those cars, are seeing less oil changes because they're not driven 12 months a year. Some cars are only driven 4 months a year. That means pretty much the other 8 months of the year, the car is sitting there and the oil is staying stagnant in the engine, okay? Another big thing is when you go to crank the car up. You know, if you store the car, don't just go out to the garage, crank the car up, let it run until the coolant temperature gauge says 180 because it's February and it's snowing and you can't drive the car. It's better not to crank the car than it is to do that, because doing that will build condensation in the engine oil that always makes those used oil analysis not look as good. So again, since we don't know exactly what leads into all this, and we do know that there are variables that play into it, maybe, just maybe, engines that have the oil changed when people think they need it versus calendar time are a leading contributor. The lifeblood of combustion is fuel. Nobody can argue that. We have to have fuel to make the engine work. It's one of those things where it's live by the sword, die by the sword with today's modern fuel, okay? Ethanol is one of the things that enrich our fuels today, but it's not the only thing. A lot of times ethanol gets a lot of the blame or all of the blame for fuel-related problems. But understand, as developers, we've found other additives in modern fuels that play just as big of a role as the ethanol does. It's not a video about fuel, so I'm not going to go into all that. I will just tell you, as a collector of vehicles of all types, from military vehicles, you name it, I've experienced a lot when it comes to fuel. And most recently, I've noticed a big difference in engines that we have been using ethanol or modern fuels in and change over to a recreational fuel. Very recently, I've actually found a source here to buy recreational fuel, and I found that every one of my cars makes better power, it runs better on this recreational fuel. Now, don't get it confused with ethanol-free modern fuel. This is truly recreational fuel. It is basically marked Rec 90. It is really the old fuel and premium grade before it gets all the other additives and ethanol added into it. Now, in 5 of my personal vehicles, I ran them almost out of fuel, really close to the bottom of the tank. I dumped in a full tank of the recreational fuel, and immediately the engine ran better. It also, a lot of times, would then immediately run horribly. And let me tell you what was happening. As I would dump this new fuel in on an almost empty tank of the old ethanol-laced fuel, I would end up with a fuel filter full of water, or I would end up with a carburetor full of water, or in a fuel-injected engine, if the water made it through the filter, I would end up with a fuel pressure regulator that was blocked with water. This happened on every vehicle that I've owned that I've did this with. Everything from a 1944 Volkswagen Kübelwagen to a Mercedes 500e and even modern Porsches. In 5 different occasions I had this happen. I would run the tank really low on fuel, dump in the other fuel. It rejected the water that was actually pulled into the ethanol because ethanol is hydroscopic, okay? And then you go back to the recreational fuel, which is really what we used to run in the old days, and it would repel the water. As soon as it repelled the water, it would force it into the fuel system, out into the filter or into the injectors, and immediately it made my cars run like crap. I had to go in, clean the fuel systems, then they ran beautifully. But then I noticed that I had to change my ignition timing and my jetting on my old cars, or sometimes the fuel pressure wanted to be changed on the modern cars, okay? What I'm getting at is the elements in modern fuel are not beneficial to our vehicles. They're not beneficial to anything more than politics and the environment, okay? So these are things that are playing into the right fuel selection. If you're in an area where you can buy recreational fuel, then I highly suggest that you run the recreational fuel if it's legal in your state. If you choose to do that, you may end up needing a fuel filter change soon thereafter or a fuel pressure regulator. I've actually changed my regimen now. I don't add that fuel on an empty tank. If I do, I drain the fuel tank completely and drain the entire fuel system. And yes, usually I do that and I get water out of it because it's been ran on ethanol fuel for a while. A lot of my cars do a lot of static time. They don't get driven every day. I do drive them all, but sometimes once a month. That helps to make the hydroscopic nature of that ethanol-laced fuel do its job. Then I dump in the old fuel and it would repel it. I end up with a fuel filter full of water. So drain your tank if you want to start using a recreational type fuel. Now, if you end up using this fuel that's called ethanol-free, it may still have some of the other additives. You need to do some research in your area and try to figure out exactly what the composition of that fuel is. Different regions are different, all different places across the world. People are watching this video worldwide. It's not just here in the States. So pay attention to your fuel. At the same time, buy premium fuel. I can't tell you how many times I have people say, I bought my fuel at Costco, or, I bought my fuel at Walmart, or whatever. You have a Porsche, you have a premium vehicle. It must run on premium fuel, not just premium octane, but premium fuel, okay? So a lot of these cheap stations out there have water in their fuel. They're not getting the best stuff they can get, okay? My favorite fuel, if we're using the modern fuel, is Shell V-Power. Here in Georgia, we can get 93 octane. If you're in California, I know you can only get 91. But from a stability perspective, the Shell V-Power is what I recommend for my engines we build here at Flat 6. And we don't really have problems. Every now and then a customer will say, I've got fuel at this Shell station. I drove a mile and the car stopped. Yeah, well, you got a tank full of water. I'm sorry. We had a customer about 2 years ago, he got 14 gallons of water and the remainder of his tank was filled with fuel. That's all he got. He cranked the car up, made it 300 yards, the car died, and we drained 14 gallons of separated water out of his tank. We've been having flooding conditions here. It flooded for weeks on end, and I believe that played into it. So if you've been getting a lot of rain in your area and you see a fuel truck pull up, don't buy fuel at that station while they're filling the tanks. It's common sense, okay? At the same time, usually if you get a tank full of water like that, other people in your area are going to have the same problem, or in the case of our customer, there was 2 other cars broken down about a half mile up from him that had the same thing happen. It was very conclusive. So bad fuel does happen. But premium fuel is what I'm trying to get across here, and keeping the fuel system clean. Now these cars past 2001 did not have a fuel filter that can be changed. The fuel filter is incorporated kind of inside the pump as a strainer in the tank, so you can't change that like you can on an 01 or earlier car, and that further leads to problems. So now let's talk about fuel injectors. We talked about fuel being the lifeblood of the engine, but in amounts that the engine cannot burn completely, that fuel will then become the enemy of the engine. If there's one consistent thing that we've seen always be tied into cylinder bore scoring per cylinder, it has been failed fuel injectors. Now, a lot of times these will not lead to misfires. A lot of times they don't really have a lot of symptoms. But running this modern ethanol-based fuel with all these additives in it, cars sit around a lot of times, the fuel gets old, doesn't have very much storage capability these days. That is playing into fuel injectors that are doing 2 major things. One, having an irregular spray pattern. An irregular spray pattern is going to make that fuel fall from suspension. The fuel will no longer be atomized in the air. It's going to fall from suspension and enter into your combustion chamber as drops of fuel. Fuel droplets cannot thoroughly burn. So that always makes an engine have a tendency to run over-enriched, okay? Fuel is a very good solvent. I can wash parts in fuel. I said that in one of our earlier videos. You can also wash the engine oil from your cylinder walls if you have unburned fuel in the cylinders. So an injector that is failing to deliver an atomized spray of fuel that can be completely burned is always going to help wash that protective layer of oil from your cylinder walls. We believe this is a contributing factor and have data to support this. You know, an engine comes in like this particular one, let's say it loses cylinder number 5. Well, we pull the injectors out, do an invasive inspection of the injectors as well as a regular test, and we find out, yeah, the injector on cylinder 5 had a poor spray pattern, okay? At the same time, the biggest thing we're learning with injectors is the fuel is affecting the ability of the injector to hold back leak down. So these engines run with 55 to 60 psi of fuel pressure generally, okay? When you shut the engine off, the engine should hold fuel pressure for a long time. But if the injectors are starting to get aged or they are starting to fail internally, then they have no ability to hold that pressure. So we've seen some cars come into us that had cylinders that were failing, wouldn't hold more than 10 or 15 pounds of fuel pressure for more than about 10 or 15 minutes, okay? An engine that has new injectors in it should hold that 50 psi plus for hours and hours and hours, if not overnight, okay? So if you have an injector that is leaking down when you shut the engine off, that's a problem. Now this is very hard to test for. Some people always want to prove things. I'm one of those people. But I learned that sometimes the testing regimens do not include factors that we are seeing in real operation with these engines. So when you send your injectors out to have them tested, they may come back and show the spray pattern is fine. They may come back and show the leak down is fine. Don't be fooled. Don't stop there. Actually do a test like what we've performed here, where we actually watch the injector at a heated up temperature, like it's going to see in a just shut down engine, and watch for fuel to dribble out of that injector, or watch for the pressure to drop. This is how we've learned these things, not by listening to other people, not by believing test reports, by doing our own firsthand inspections of these things and doing really common sense invasive types of testing. Now, with this, we've seen a lot of times an engine that just shuts down will have fuel dribble from the injectors when it would not do that if the injector was tested cold. So in a lab environment, you cannot completely test the injector the way it is ran in operation in an engine, okay? These are key things. So if you send your injectors out to have them cleaned, they come back, usually it'll have a poor spray pattern on a couple of them. Usually the testing is pretty good for spray pattern. The testing for leak down is always off based on our direct experience. So my recommendation, if you have one of these cars and you want to drive it for a long period of time and you want to have your absolute best chance of avoiding bore scoring, replace the fuel injectors. Don't replace them with a rebuilt one because it may be worse than what you already have. Buy a new fuel injector. New injectors are the only way to go. Now, I don't have anything to sell you. You can't call me and buy injectors. Remember, the only thing I have to sell you is a complete engine if you don't listen or if you have bad luck, even after you did listen, okay? So I can't sell you injectors. I'm not making money from telling you to go buy injectors. We're not invested in Bosch, okay, or any other injector manufacturer. But I have learned if you want to live as long as you can with one of these engines, you must remove the fuel variable from an aggravation point to bore scoring. So the last point I want to bring up here about helping you prevent bore scoring, by helping you understand things, is you need to have a good way to go in and do a diagnostic interrogation of your engine, and to do that when it's running good, okay? You want to be able to go in and see when the engine doesn't have any known problems, when it runs perfectly, what your actual values are for your environment, the way you drive the car, the way it stands today. The tool that I use for that a lot of times with my customers is called Durametric, okay? Now, it's a Porsche-specific diagnostic testing kit, okay? And the fellows at Durametric, they're not invested in my company. I'm not getting paid by them to say any of this sort of thing. They don't even know I'm going to tell you to go buy a Durametric. The reason I'm going to tell you to buy it is because it's the cheapest tool that is Porsche-specific that will help you do the things that a shop can do. Now here at Flat 6, we have the P-Wiz systems, we have Autologic system, we have other systems that are professional grade systems. At the same time, having those and experience with them teaches us that Durametric can do almost the same things. And honestly, from a developmental perspective, there are things about the Durametric that I find superior to that of some of the newer systems. The way you can go in and do a data log, the way you can watch graphs and plots, you can't even do that with Autologic or some of these tools that cost $60,000, $80,000 sometimes for pros to use. Here at my training facility, for the knowledge group, we do classes, hands-on classes, and a lot of Porsche shops that come to these classes only have a Durametric for working on Porsches, and they're able to effectively do their job and do that with a customer's car, okay? There's professional versions of Durametric and enthusiast. Really, the only difference between the two is one allows you to do multiple VIN numbers, the other allows you to do like 1 or 3 VIN numbers as an enthusiast kit. They all have the same power when it comes to diagnostics, okay? So having the Durametric helps you do one major thing, and that is watch your fuel trim. So the reason you need to watch fuel trim is because it's a great way to see if you have a fuel pump dying. If you see the engine's adding fuel, maybe you have a fuel pump that's starting to go bad, or maybe you have a vacuum leak somewhere, okay? Watching fuel trim values and being able to plot those and understand fuel trim is a key to finding vacuum leaks, finding injectors that are going bad, finding all this stuff. A lot of times you can plug it in your OBD2 port, get some data, see what a good running car is, and then collect some data. It also makes it easier if you ever wanted to basically be a part of my paid technical consulting program. I'm going to ask you for that data. I can even jump on and go to my PC. I can log in to your Durametric and I can see your car remotely, okay? That's something I do for a lot of customers that are part of that program. And I do it with my own engine shop customers. I always tell them, hey, one of the best things you can buy for your vehicle moving forward is a Durametric, because I can always be attuned to it no matter where you are as long as you got a Wi-Fi signal, okay? So these are keys. Being able to understand a healthy car helps you to diagnose one that's running poorly. And remember, a lot of this stuff is about predictive types of service, okay? If the car's running perfect, every 2 or 3 months, plug in your Durametric, see what your fuel trim values are. You know, you might find you got a cracked intake manifold. We're seeing a lot of those. You might find you have a fuel pump going bad. We're seeing a ton of fuel pumps go bad, okay? All of these things can play into an engine going over rich, especially secondary air problems, O2 sensor problems, catalytic converter problems. The engine's first go-to, the first responder to any problem is to enrich the fuel. That's what it does to help the environment, okay? Makes the catalytic converters kick in overtime and do their job. It helps the environment, but it doesn't help you, doesn't help the engine, and doesn't help your pocketbook, okay? So basically that's the ins and outs of the Durametric kit. I prefer it, and I hope that you end up purchasing one and you enjoy it as much as we do. So to close us up here for our part 5 on focus on bore scoring, I just want to say that not everybody's going to agree with the things that I'm telling you, okay? It would be a pipe dream and unicorns and rainbows for everybody to agree on everything all the time. It's just not going to happen. It's taken me a lot of years to understand that some people just don't value the truth. They don't value the facts, and they want them conveyed to them in a way that is very pleasing to them. I don't really have that trait, unfortunately. I tell you what I think you need to know based on what these hands have done with these and many other Porsche engines over the years. So in closing, I just want to say I appreciate you viewing up through this time, part 5, and I hope you understand that firsthand direct experience and getting things from a trustworthy source is always going to be the #1 tool in your battle against fighting engine problems with the M96, okay? Over years, there's been a lot of copycats, a lot of people jump on our coattails, a lot of people trying to say things to help benefit their pocketbook or their wallet. Just understand, we care about the best interest of these cars, the best interest of the owners of these cars, and we will do everything we can to help you be a great caregiver to your Porsche.